Hello guys and welcome to a new series. My name is Mustafa Salahuddin and I'm a 5th year medical student, and in this series we are going to talk about diuretics. Diuretics are drugs that make the kidney lose water, and to understand these drugs first we need to review some kidney physiology about ion and water transport in the nephron and the action sites of diuretics. And this is going to be in this video. The next videos are going to be about the different diuretics groups, which we have 5 groups. We have the low diuretics, the Thiazide diuretics, we have the potassium sparing diuretics, and the carbonic anhydrase inhibitors, and finally the osmotic diuretics. Those each would have one video about each one, but this video is going to be about the ion and water exchange in the nephron and the action sites of diuretics. So beside this, let's start. So this picture shows the nephron, which is the functional unit of the kidney, and this picture shows the glomerulus right here. So glomerulus, and then we have the bowman capsule here and the proximal convoluted tubule. And this picture shows the loop of Henle and the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct. So let's start with the proximal or the glomerulus here. So let's change color really quick. So we have blood is going here through the efferent arteriole. So efferent arteriole, this would bring the blood from here into the glomerulus, which is this part right here, and then into the efferent arteriole, which is right here. So efferent arteriole, and when the blood goes into the glomerulus, it undergoes the filtration process, which is through the glomerular basement membrane. So the blood will go through this, and not all of the blood components will go through this. We would have the water would filtrate. So water, organic compounds, and ions would all undergo filtration into the bowman capsule here, except for different blood cells and proteins, because if we have the proteins go through, we would have nephrotic syndrome, which is abnormal, and that happens when the glomerular basement membrane slits would be widened by different type of diseases. Yeah, so in the normal process, we would have only the water, the organic compounds, and the ions would filtrate through from the glomerulus into the bowman capsule, and those would be called the filtrate. So the filtrate would go through the bowman capsule, then into here, which is into the proximal convoluted tubule right here. Yeah, so in the proximal convoluted tubule, we would have reabsorption process happen. So we have filtration here, then we have reabsorption through different parts of the nephron. In the proximal convoluted tubule, a majority of sodium would be reabsorbed here. So we would have sodium, 65% of sodium is filtrated here through the proximal convoluted tubule, which is huge, and the same amount of water is filtrated through the proximal convoluted tubule here, so 65% of water, because as we know, the sodium and water moves together. It is salt and water relationship here. So salt and water, so they move together. So 65% of sodium and 65% of water. We would also have another types of ions also filtrated or reabsorbed through the proximal convoluted tubule. We would have potassium, and we would have amino acids, different organic compounds also are reabsorbed, and we would have some of the calcium and magnesium are reabsorbed through the proximal convoluted tubule also. Also in the proximal convoluted tubule we have secretion of some compounds like uric acid. So uric acid would be secreted into the filtrate. So secretion process happen here. So uric acid, but interestingly enough, the uric acid is reabsorbed again in the proximal convoluted tubule. Another fact I want to mention here is that there is no diuretic group works on the proximal convoluted tubule. That's because the proximal convoluted tubule cells are very resistant to the diuretics, and this is a good thing, because imagine if we have a diuretic that blocks 65% of Na to be reabsorbed, so we would lose about 65% of the water going through the filtrate, and this is very high percentage and would lead to the body going into hypovolemic state and maybe hypovolemic shock. Yeah, so this is one fact. The other fact that I forget to mention here is that the speed of filtration through the glomerulus into the bowman capsule is about 120 milliliters per minute. And if we make that number into days, not minutes, so it would be 173. By multiplying the 120 by 60, then by 24, we will get the number by days, which is 173 liters per day. And 99% of this number would be reabsorbed again. So 99% would be reabsorbed again, and that's why our urine volume would not exceed 1.5 liters per day urine. So we have filtration, then we have reabsorption in the proximal convoluted tubule, and we don't have a single diuretic group that works directly on the proximal convoluted tubule. So let's make it here. We don't have diuretic group works on PCT, proximal convoluted tubule. Now let's move on to the loop of Henle. So the filtrate would move from the proximal convoluted tubule into the loop of Henle through here. It would move through here from the descending part, then into the ascending part here, where it undergoes reabsorption of sodium. That's by, so we have Na here, reabsorption of 25% of sodium. And we would also have reabsorption of the majority of calcium and magnesium. So I mentioned that we undergo reabsorption of some of the calcium and magnesium in the proximal convoluted tubule. Well, the majority of these ions are reabsorbed here in the ascending part of the loop of Henle. And the sodium is reabsorbed by a transporter which is called the NaKCl transporter. So it would reabsorb sodium, potassium and chloride. So as you could imagine, we have 25% sodium, we have calcium and magnesium, we have also potassium by the NaKCl, and we have chloride. Those all reabsorbed by the ascending part of the loop of Henle. Interestingly enough, this ascending part of the loop of Henle is impermeable to water, and as I said earlier, the water moves with the sodium. So if we have 25% reabsorption of the sodium, interestingly enough, it would be reabsorbed in the descending part here. So we would have 25% of water reabsorbed from the descending part. And in total, the loop of Henle would reabsorb 25% of water and sodium. And the diuretic groups, or the diuretic group that works on this part of the kidney or of the nephron, it's called the loop diuretics. So loop diuretics, it would antagonize this transporter, the NaKCl transporter, and we would have we would get 25% we would lose 25% of sodium and 25% of water, and this is very high, as you could imagine. We would also lose the calcium and magnesium in the filtrate and into the urine. We would also lose the potassium and the chloride, and we also lose the hydrogen too. So we would lose 7 things. If we use the loop diuretics, we would lose sodium, calcium, magnesium, water, potassium, chloride and hydrogen. And those are the most potent diuretics that would give us the best effect compared to the other groups. Now, moving on, the filtrate will go through into the distal convoluted tubule, and the distal convoluted tubule is splitted into 2 parts regarding from a pharmacology point. So it would be divided into proximal part, so proximal distal convoluted tubule and distal convoluted tubule. In the proximal convoluted tubule, we would reabsorb about 5 to 7% of sodium. So 5 to 7% of sodium, and that's by the NaCl transporter. So NaCl transporter here in the proximal distal convoluted tubule would reabsorb 5 to 7% of sodium, and also, as you could imagine, the water moves with the salt, so we would also get 5 to 7% reabsorption of water, and we would also reabsorb some of the calcium here by the action of the parathyroid hormone. So calcium is also reabsorbed here in the proximal part of the distal convoluted tubule by the action of the parathyroid hormone. And the diuretic group that works on the proximal part of the distal convoluted tubule is called the thiazide diuretics. So thiazide, and the thiazide diuretics would antagonize this transporter, the NaCl transporter. So we would lose 5 to 7% of Na, and we would lose 5 to 7% of water. And this is the most used diuretic group. It is used for hypertension mostly. Now moving on to the distal convoluted tubule here. So in the distal convoluted tubule, let's erase this so we have some space. So in the distal convoluted tubule, we have the sodium and water are reabsorbed. So sodium and water, and it is about 2 or 3 to 5% of sodium and water are reabsorbed, but they are reabsorbed in expense of potassium and hydrogen, and that's all by the action of aldosterone. So here, aldosterone. So in the distal part of the distal convoluted tubule, the aldosterone would reabsorb sodium and water in expense of potassium and hydrogen. And the diuretic group that works on this part of the nephron, the distal part of the distal convoluted tubule, is called the potassium sparing diuretics. So it's potassium sparing diuretics. It would antagonize the aldosterone. So when it antagonizes the aldosterone, we would lose 3 to 5% of sodium and water, and we also conserve the potassium and the hydrogen. So that's why it's called potassium sparing diuretics. Then the filtrate goes through into the collecting duct here, collecting duct, and that's where the antidiuretic hormone tries to reabsorb some more of the water and sodium here. Yeah, so that's so here I mentioned the 3 types of diuretic groups. We have the low diuretics, we have the thiazide, and we have the potassium sparing diuretics. So 1 and 2 and 3. In this series we also going to talk about 2 more different groups that work indirectly. So we have the osmotic diuretics, and we have the carbonic anhydrase inhibitors. So carbonic anhydrase inhibitors. Yeah. So that's it for this video. The next video is going to be about the low diuretics. So stay tuned for that. And thank you guys for watching. Yeah, and see you in the next time. Peace.